Oh, okay. So thank you for joining me today. Today our presentation is growing wild with native plants. I'm Laura Thomas. So for those that don't know me, I own Hidden Habitat, which is a native plant nursery in Gravenhurst, technically Kilworthy, but it's just outside of Gravenhurst, where we grow native species, native to Ontario species. We also do ecological landscaping and design. Um, so that's part of what brought me to native plants was supporting wildlife. And I feel like that's a common thread for a lot of native plant gardeners, which is kind of why I do this talk, because I find often people know that they want to support wildlife and know that native plants are really an integral part of that. But really connecting those two together as to why it really improves that connection to nature and can make your garden or your landscape, whatever you're using, much more powerful. It's knowing, what species to include and that kind of thing. So, like I said before, there's lots of reasons to garden for wildlife. A lot of us obviously want to just support and conserve nature. Um, some of us want to feel connected to nature, to better understand nature. I know a huge benefit for me is, when I go out into our gardens, is having that interaction with being able to see monarch caterpillars or songbirds, or you get to see the little bumblebees, pollinating in like a turtle head, which is um, the picture there. And it's just really, it's like awe-inspiring, right? Like we all have those moments where it's like really powerful, which is a fantastic thing, because what happens with that is that it really spurs us to take further action with nature conservation as well. So it's a little bit of like nature advocacy almost that we can do in our backyard. Because even if we do it and we bring others to enjoy that, you never know what impression that'll make. And then, in addition to all those benefits that we get, obviously wildlife is going to benefit. And it's sadly at a time too now where there is a lot of habitat loss. There's a lot of fragmentation, degradation of nature reserves. I was talking earlier about Bill C5 that's coming down the pipeline through our Ontario government that is going to pull back legislation for the Endangered Species Act. So, there's a lot of threats that are coming, down at a time where we're seeing massive decline in populations. And so this is kind of some of the sad news. And it's one thing I always like to acknowledge, these stats are actually 10 years old, if not older, because, it was kind of released in 2014, but a lot of these numbers are based on years older than that. And so from 2014, things have actually gotten worse, not better. Um, so whatever we're able to do on our private land can have a lot of impact to support, our grassland birds, even if it's bats and insects and things we maybe, some of us probably truly love them, but sometimes, and I feel like people, the idea of having a yard full of like bats and spiders might not be as wonderful. But, at the end of the presentation, I hope you'll kind of
The hell is
come
it?
to see that it's going to be a wonderful thing. And
Mm.
then, why we kind of push to have that, wildlife space or, a native plant garden in our backyards or community gardens is that private land is such a big dominant use of land right now. And we used to kind of think that, park sanctuaries, refuges, reserves were enough. That's like where the wildlife lived. Like we lived, in our suburbs, in our cities, even if we lived out in the country, in Muskoka, it was still kind of like separate. And obviously, a lot of nature reserves are fragmented still. They're far between. There's not enough land for migratory species. So it's just not enough. So that's why we kind of need to like step up and offer some of that privately held land, like in our homes, to provide ecological services. And what can be really powerful is that even for those that have really small spaces, so if you live in the city or a suburb and your yard is quite small, um, you might think that this isn't going to have a huge impact, but it's like if we collectively all make that decision to do it, it can just be one piece of a tiny, one tiny piece of a puzzle. And once we, compile that puzzle, it can actually have a big impact. And the pictures on the right is like you can see in the top photo, depending on how big your screen is and how good your eyesight is, there's a tiny little red dot. And that was a customer's property that we did her front yard in a native plant
Mhm.
garden. And it's a very traditional suburb. There's a lot of lawn everywhere. We did it during COVID, and a lot of people were out walking because they had nowhere else to go. So there's a lot of questions and like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And she had a nice couple of signs made up as well to show people what she was doing. And we've kind of kept in touch since then. She said she felt like since she put that garden in her front yard, it kind of gave people permission to do so themselves, whether or not they took out all their lawn. They, added some native species, they expanded their garden beds. So it's just there to show that like, the small actions we do can have like a trickle down effect or a butterfly effect. And some of that, sometimes people get really caught up in like the numbers of like how much we should really be converting and how much needs to be wild to support wildlife. And I don't see this as much anymore now, but when the COP15 was happening, um, there was a big push to have 30% of terrestrial or like land converted to like wild spaces by 2030. So it was like 30% had to be wild. And it was just like a number that sounded sexy and good because it was 30 by 30. There was no scientific backing to it. So I like as much as you can do is probably beneficial. There was also some research that came out that said 70% of our landscapes had to be native in order to support songbirds, or more specifically chickadees. Um, and this was true, but it was done in an urban landscape, and they were talking specifically about native trees. So, and we'll get into like why trees matter. But like it's important to kind of realize that like it really depends where you are in a larger landscape and what you're looking at. And always to remember like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And the second best time is now. So not to necessarily always get caught up in if it's enough and just start. And so we're obviously here to talk about native plants and wildlife, and a lot of the conversation is like, the disconnect, sorry, sometimes happens is like why native plants matter. And it really comes back to like that grade 10 biology class we all took, and plants being the foundation of the food web. Essentially we live, we breathe, we eat all because of plants. Um, they you get that's like the food web or the food chain. Like the grasshopper eats the grass and the mouse eats um, the grasshopper and so on and so forth. But they've also they've created the world we live on. Without plants we wouldn't be here. So it's very much that we're just living on their planet. I always like to think of it in that way. And they've created these relationships with everything else on it. And they were here kind of first, and so all the flora and fauna have evolved to have those relationships. And one of the most um, iconic examples of that, and the best examples, is the monarch and the milkweed. So we all are pretty familiar with it probably. So the monarch caterpillar has to feed off of milkweed. the in order to survive. It actually can't eat anything else. So if it gets dropped on tropical milkweed or a dogbane or something that looks similar to a milkweed, it doesn't thrive and it actually can die. So because it's had this relationship for thousands and thousands of years, it's put all of its eggs kind of in the milkweed basket, which was fine for it, to be honest. So it had a pretty consistent food source because there was lots of different types of milkweed in a variety of different habitats. So we have like common milkweed, swamp milkweed, butterfly milkweed. That's just in Ontario, and there's other types of milkweed found further south, and there's pokeweed as well. Um, so it had a lot of really great food sources. And because milkweeds are toxic, so you break it open and it has that white sap in it. It's toxic to a lot of things. There's only a few insects that can actually digest it. It was a pretty stable food source because nothing else was eating it. And even better, they were actually able to adapt to be able not only to eat this toxic milkweed, but monarchs were able to kind of ingest the toxin and become toxic themselves or poisonous to predators. So it had a really stable food source, and it also, was pretty resistant against a lot of predatory behavior. So it was kind of winning in life for a long time. And then humans kind of came on the landscape, or I should say, like European humans. We came to North America and found that, like, we didn't really like this milkweed very much because it poisoned our cattle. It was kind of perceived as weedy. It traveled everywhere, especially common milkweed. It popped up in places we didn't like. So it was, a pest for agriculture. So we eradicated from our fields, from our meadows, from our gardens, and we got to a point now where it's not as common as it once was. And now we have the monarchs being listed as an endangered species, acknowledging also that I recognize a lot of that threat comes from its wintering grounds in Mexico too, that their habitat in Mexico is also threatened. So it's kind of a double whammy for them. But that's just kind of that example of that relationship that milkweed and that plants can have. So you can kind of imagine plants over like, hundreds of thousands of years. They're trying to find ways to kind of adapt so things aren't eating them, right? So the milkweed's creating this toxic sap so things won't eat it, so it'll thrive and have babies and grow everywhere else. But things that are also surviving in the same ecosystems or over thousands of years are adapting ways to eat it. So it's like this push and pull mechanism, and it's those relationships that are at the heart of why native plants matter. And you can plant a dahlia, for example. It's not native to Ontario or North America. And it's not going to be a host plant. The nectar will probably feed pollinators in its adult life cycle, but it's not going to support wildlife throughout the whole life cycle. So that's really what we want to do. And when we're gardening for wildlife, is really consider what a species need or what wildlife needs throughout its whole life cycle and not just at one point in time. So I always like to kind of share this quote by Carol Smyers. It's like when you plant a native species, you're employing all of evolutionary history, and you can't find a better reason for choosing a plant than that gained from 3 billion years of experience. Um, so it kind of perfectly is, encapsulates what and why we plant like native plants, because they kind of do everything that they're supposed to do. And so, what exactly is a native plant? For a long time, 20 years ago when I was studying native plants in university, I remember just learning that it was anything that lived in an area. So let's say Muskoka or Ontario, before colonialization. So If it was here before then it's considered a native plant. And that's pretty holds true to this day. Um, if it wasn't brought here through humans means over a large period of, over a long distance, then it's a native plant. But there's obviously issues sometimes with that definition, because at heart, what really matters is not so much that the plant was here at a certain time or not and how it moved. It's actually how it interacts with the ecosystem. So that's really how we will define a plant now, or a native plant, I should say. And so the Ecological Landscape Association has a really good quote on what they consider a native plant. And it's one that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. It's a bit of a mouthful, I recognize that, but it kind of really just fully covers the fact that this is a plant that's supposed to be here. It's been here for obviously a really long time, and it has a relationship with all the other things in that area. And so, what really gets native plant gardeners hung up, I see now, is like native to where. And I see this all the time in like, there's a native plant of Ontario gardening group, I think, on Facebook. And if a plant, you can see sometimes their plants are sold, it's a native species. And it depending on who the supplier is, if they're a North American supplier, it's native to North America, it's native to Canada, and they're not wrong. But perhaps it's not native to Ontario, right? So like you can think about like a columbine that's native to British Columbia. It's not going to be native to Ontario, and it's not going to have that relationship with all the species here. Um, but we can also think that a plant that is native to Ontario might not be native to Toronto or Muskoka. A perfect example of that is butterfly milkweed. So butterfly milkweed is native to Ontario. It's found more in the southern areas of Ontario in the Carolinian zone, but it's not native to Muskoka. So people sometimes hesitate. Oh, I don't know if I should be planting it because it's not native to this area. And when we do plant it up here, it still functions the same way that it would be if we planted it in southern Ontario, because it is still a host plant for monarch butterflies. So monarchs obviously still migrate through Muskoka. They're still laying their eggs on butterfly milkweed. So by all means, I encourage using it. We use it all the time because it's a beautiful milkweed. It's bright orange. It's very well behaved. It's a true long living perennial, as opposed to common milkweed that kind of does move around quite a bit. So knowing kind of like where things are native to and like how they interact is important. For generally, you want to just look that it's like native to Ontario, recognizing that you don't need to get hung up so much on like geopolitical boundaries. There's species that are not native to Ontario, like purple coneflower, that function beautifully. They just, they're found in really southern, perhaps populations of southern Ontario and just south of the border. But when we plant them here, they still support pollinators and songbirds. So, we don't need to get kind of like so hung up in the weeds.
It's super you up to.
And so these are also just like different eco zones, eco regions, eco districts. Um, and it kind of will just show you like where um, different boundaries are essentially. So, we're obviously up here in Muskoka. It's a very different landscape than south of us. So we kind of covered this already. So for simplicity, you can use the geopolitical boundary of Ontario. If you don't know, there's obviously some guidebooks and databases out there. That's just a few. The network of natures is a good one. Ontario Wildflowers is a good website as well, and it'll show you what's native or not native. And then we have all our species that are just kind of out there that look native, that grow in our meadows and our roadsides and sides of our trails that are really beautiful and striking. And we call them wildflowers, but they're not necessarily native. And these are our non-native, sometimes invasive, sometimes not, species. So Queen Anne's lace, Dame's rocket, Viper's blood gloss, chicory. I always say if, people are probably more familiar with our non-native wildflowers than they are with our true native species because they're the ones that literally grow everywhere. Um, so I always say to be cautious when you are collecting seeds or if you're going to be wanting to garden that way is to be really aware of what you're collecting and growing and that it's a true native species and that especially you're not promoting the growth of invasive species. Um, and then we have nativars. So nativars are just cultivated native plants. They've been hybridized, kind of have very specific characteristics. So echinaceas or coneflowers are a perfect example of that. You can go to any garden center and it's just like rows and rows of coneflowers of different colors, right? You can get orange, white, deep pinks, and different purples. And then there's also examples of, like the nine bark Diablo, where traditionally a nine bark is a green leaf. It normally doesn't have that purple red leaf. I always say that if your main goal or main priority for your garden is to support wildlife, choose a true native species. So don't go down the native pathway. And you'll know that it's a true native if it actually has, I always say use it if it has a scientific name. So like Echinacea propoa for purple coneflower. If it has like cute little name like white swan or Diablo, then that's a dead giveaway that it's a nativar. A nativar might not be a horrible thing. It's not going to become an invasive species or anything, but it may not support wildlife like you want it to. So you can imagine um, the nine bark, for example, has a totally different color leaf. It's going to change the chemistry. It's going to change how the plant looks, obviously, to pollinators and songbirds, anything that's going to want to use it as a food source. It's going to change the taste. So it's not used by its insects that would normally use it as a host plant. Whereas something like an echinacea white swan, the petal changes color from like purple to white might not have a big impact. Um, but if you want to ensure that you're getting like full benefit out of it, go with the true native species. And this is a big one. So sometimes we think, oh, if it's a native species, you can kind of put whatever you want and you're going to support wildlife. And it's not necessarily true because in ecology, we have what's called keystone species. And these are species that kind of do our heavy lifting, right? You can think in our own communities, there's people out there that are volunteering, that are doing a lot. They're just killing it, doing everything in the community. And, nature's the same way. There's just a few species that are really supporting a lot of wildlife. And so, if you really want to kind of get the most bang for your buck, it's great to include some of these keystone species in your landscape. So, you can kind of further definition of a keystone species. It's like it's not necessarily the biggest, or it's not necessarily the species that has the most in the landscape. It's just that if it's no longer there, if it gets eradicated, it kind of will set off a chain of events that turns that structure and biodiversity of its habitat into something very different. So we really want to make sure that we include our keystone species. And there's some further statistics there. I don't need to read it out for you. You guys can kind of read that yourself. It's just showing that it's usually just a small percentage that does a lot of that heavy lifting. And so what those species are, and some of you might have already heard about this already, are a lot of our native trees. So, trees really are really important if you have space for them. So, oaks, so not one specific oak. So when if we planted, say, like a red oak or a white oak or a bur oak, it's not going to support 500 species of moths and butterflies. But the family as a whole of Quercus, all the different types of oaks will support that many species of moths and butterflies, which is still a tremendous amount. And so willows are another great species that support a lot of keystone species. Our native cherries, which are flowering right now in Muskoka. So if you're driving down the road and you see a bunch of beautiful trees and flower, it's either serviceberry or our native cherries. Some other species is the goldenrod, wild strawberry, that little tiny fella that grows in everyone's lawn that sometimes people love or hate. Supports 80 different species of moths and butterflies. Violets are native violets. There is a non-native. The sweet violet is a bit of a weedy one. Unfortunately, it doesn't support the moths and butterflies. Asters as well. So including a lot of these can really um, ensure that you're supporting a lot of different species of moths and butterflies. And we'll kind of get into like why moths and butterflies matter. So why are we focusing on just moths and butterflies? So when we kind of think about like that food web or like that food cycle, um, the next stage is obviously insects. And caterpillars are a really important food source in our landscape in North America. They feed a tremendous amount of different species, anything from bears, foxes, raccoons. They're out there eating caterpillars. They're really easy to eat. They're squishy, so they can feed a lot of like young animals because they're not like crunchy, especially when you think about like a young songbird. It's not going to be wanting to eat crunchy beetles. It's very easy for a mama bird to kind of just like throw back a nice little squishy caterpillar. And caterpillars have a lot of protein, so they're, protein rich. They have carotenoids, which is really important even for us as humans in early development. So if we got rid of caterpillars on the landscape, have massive repercussions. And Douglas Tallamy, who's a researcher in the United States, he studies the relationship between native plants and insects. He's an entomologist. And he, through observation on his own property, found that a chickadee, when they're raising their clutch, like their nest, can bring upwards of 400 to 600 caterpillars to their nest in just one single day. So you can imagine how many caterpillars there are, or what is needed to support all the different species that use caterpillars. Because it's not just chickadees, like all of our songbirds eat them. And like I said, it's not just birds that are eating them. Frogs, toads, snakes, bears, like I said earlier. So, when we're walking around, we often don't notice that there's so many caterpillars everywhere, but they're in our mostly being supported by our tree species. And then I like to throw this out there because I think it's just a cool little fun fact. So when we think back to our keystone species of like the oaks, willows, and cherries, it kind of plays in again when we think about gulls. So gulls, I think, are a really neat thing that we have. Often they're as gardeners, they're really maligned and we think they're ugly and they're diseased and they're going to kill a plant and they're horrible. When really they're this really neat part of nature where a little parasite, like a little wasp or a little insect, is able to somehow have this communication with a plant and force, like almost like a parasitic relationship, and force that plant to grow a different form and a little house for it so that it can have a little nest. And so it'll lay its eggs in there, and you get these little gulls. Sometimes if, depending on a tree or something, if it's weak, it can weaken trees. But most of the time, because these, insects don't want to kill their host plant, they don't want to kill the tree that keeps them alive. It's often just an aesthetic thing. So here we have like oak gall, and a goldenrod gall. And so, you know, most galls are actually found on oaks, willows, and cherries. So again, it shows the value of these keystone species. And why they're so important is because they're like these little protein packs that birds will break into, specifically in the winter months. Bears are known to eat them as well. They'll just rip them open and eat the little eggs that are in there. So they can have like a really big impact on wildlife, just those little things. And I just think it's, a neat example of like, again, how nature kind of knows what it's doing. And so in addition to all those like keystone species, those generalists, those oaks and willows that are doing, like I said, a lot of the heavy lifting, they're like really supporting a massive amount of species. We also have species like milkweeds that are supporting like very few species, but they're literally supporting a whole species. So, like a monarch who wouldn't be able to thrive um, if we got rid of milkweed. So, a lot of different insects will be like what's called a generalist. So, they're not too fussy. They can lay their eggs or have food sources that are, a variety of different species. So, whether it's like oaks, maples, if it's your meadow sweets or nine barks, they're not overly fussy. And then we have our specialists that are extremely fussy. And it's nice to include these species. If you know, like, you want to have black swallowtails in your yard, you just really love the butterfly, you really want to support them. Well, then you need to have golden Alexanders, because that specifically supports black swallowtails. And I like to kind of reference that it's not always um, the moths and the butterflies that are like super fussy. We also have birds that can be just as fussy and other species as well. But the Kirkland's warbler is like a tiny little warbler. It was pretty much like extirpated from Ontario. It's pretty threatened because it will only make its nest on jack pines, and jack pines of a certain size. So usually, I can't remember how tall, but like a 20-year-old tree or something, I believe. So jack pines are used to once be a much more common species, and mostly found in like southern oak savanna type areas. And now they're not a very common species. They require fire. They really need like a fire to go through to set the cone and kind of enable that cone to germinate. So we don't have really fire on the landscape as much anymore. So we don't really have jack pine as much in the landscape, and so we don't have Kirkland's warblers. So they are bringing back plantations of jack pine, and there's some of that in like Barrie behind the museum, the Simcoe Museum. And I think they've actually had successful nesting there, which is kind of cool. And so this is just kind of like a little capture. So we want to make sure that we're planting native species to Ontario, planting true native species, if you can include keystone species, as well as specialists. And then, when we're creating a garden essential, it's not necessarily just about the moths and the butterflies. And you want to really make sure you're creating a food hub. So, like, songbirds, salamanders, they're all like us. We need food, shelter, water. Um, you know, Anything above and beyond that is just great, but in order to thrive, that's what we need. So there are other kind of food sources to consider. So pollen and nectar sources from spring to fall. Our native plants are going to be really great. They often are better suited to native species. There's a lot of native bees that are specialist pollinators that will only pollinate certain native plants. Um, and then again, host plants, so edible leaves and flower parts for pollinators, including seeds and berries for winter foraging. And then when we create our native plant garden, what we're also creating is just pretty much an ecosystem that welcomes other things. So having spiders and flies that come in, you're feeding all the insectivore songbirds. So it's kind of like a community is really what you want to create. And then water. So if you're not close to water, or you don't have a pond or anything, you can obviously um, provide water through like rain gardens, bird baths, that kind of thing. Um, Puddling areas, which are just like depressions with rocks in the ground. A cool plant to include if you have the space, because it's a really large plant that overseeds pretty prolifically, is cup plant. And I call it the hat trick of wildlife gardening because it provides food, water, and shelter. And so it's called cup plant because you can see in the picture the leaves clasp the stem and it holds water. So when it rains, water fills the little cup, and you'll often see like little birds and things like that dip in there to get a drink. And then we also have pollen and nectar sources, and the songbirds actually devour the seeds when they mature, especially like goldfinches. And then if you let the plant grow, it's an 8 to 10 foot tall plant with really thick stems, creates this big kind of hedge almost. So you'll see birds will often like flock in there, especially during the summer months when it's quite hot, and they'll just kind of have a bit of a refuge in there, um, and shelter, which is pretty terrific. And so, having that habitat similar to the cup plant is just finding places for wildlife to seek shelter. So evergreens are fantastic for that. We often see them kind of songbirds dipping back and forth from our feeders to our white pines that are located close by. Brush piles are great if you don't want it, you know, front and foremost of your garden. You can have it in the back of your property. But they're fantastic places for like toads and garter snakes, which will eat all the little insects that you maybe don't want. Dead trees and snags are fantastic for songbirds and woodpeckers if they're safe. Obviously, we don't want to keep any widowmakers alive. Um, Leaf litter and plant stalks. Some of our native bees, like our mason bees, will actually lay eggs in the stalk of some of our perennials. So leaving our stalks up is a nice way to provide them habitat. You don't need to necessarily leave the whole plant up. Um, I think I have a picture of this later on in the webinar, but what you can do for maintenance, I know we do get into a little bit of that later in the presentation, is that you can cut them down to like a foot off the ground, because native bees won't lay their eggs any taller up. They're staying pretty close to the ground. So you can kind of cut them back a little. And so some trees and shrubs. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we had a webinar last week about native plants for Muskoka gardens. It doesn't have to be just for Muskoka, but we kind of went through all of the different um, gardening type conditions. So if you really want to get into the weeds about plants or the dirt, that webinar goes into it a lot more. And it's available on our YouTube channel as well. Some shade gardening plants. We usually get asked a lot about shade and dry shade. Wild geranium and foam flower are great. Any of our shade loving goldenrods, like our blue stemmed goldenrod, is fantastic too. For full sun, it's often a lot easier, especially if you're growing, if you really want to have like a pollinator garden where you're seeing lots of butterflies and bees. It's best to do that in a more sunny location. Obviously, like pollinators will go into shadier spots, but they tend to stick to more open, sunnier locations, especially butterflies. And they kind of like the plants that are found in sunnier locations tend to be a bit more vibrant too. So um, you attract more butterflies that way. And then when it comes to design, so you can really follow traditional design rules, like just you're essentially substituting traditional plants for native plants. Um, some people like to have a more natural look. They want to leave the leaves and leave the stalks and have it a little bit wild. It is best if you really want to attract more songbirds and butterflies, is that you plant in larger groupings. So, planting groups of three, fives, and sevens, it looks best to us from an aesthetic perspective, but it also looks better to wildlife. They're going to be more likely to like see it and see it as a healthy population and stop there, lay eggs, use it as a nectar source, etc. If you don't want your garden to be messy, or be perceived as messy, but you really want it to support wildlife, and maybe you don't want to have to worry about raking the leaves so much, we always suggest what's called the mullet gardening technique. And essentially, you're just kind of keeping it really tidy and business up at the front, and then it's a party at the back. So you're kind of grading that back, and you can do that in different ways. You can kind of like intentionally just clean the front of your garden, or what I find is a great technique is just having like a very intentional border, whether that's like a border of, say, like landscape coreopsis or like a small ornamental grass or sedge. Um, and then it really speaks to people that are looking at it as like this is an intentional space. And they tend to kind of like be okay with it, even if it's maybe perceived as being a little wild or messy. And then these are some pictures of different gardens that we've done over the years in different stages. So some of it's, the day of planting. So the stuff on the top row is the day that we planted it. So it's not fully mature yet. But I think for a lot of people looking at it, it's kind of like it could look like any other kind of Muskoka garden. These are just native species. So on the top left, it's just blue-eyed grass with some low bush blueberry. So it's gonna thrive a lot better there and support a lot more wildlife. And the bottom run is obviously a garden that's a bit more established. So it's a full front yard that a customer of ours allowed us to do. It's a fantastic project, and she's tended and cared for it wonderfully. And so it's come in really mature. And we've gone there a few times to help her maintain it. And every time we go, we see different kind of insect species, which is kind of neat. And she herself has found that like there's different things there. So things are finding its way. Like she had swamp milkweed beetles on the butterfly milkweed, but and she had never seen them before. So it was pretty exciting. And some further examples of just some projects that we worked on, of just different pairings of different plantings. So bottom right is just little blue stem and New Jersey tea, which is a fantastic pairing. And then dense blazing star, which is the bottom left, the pink magenta stalk, which is great for pollinator gardens, because it really does attract a lot of butterflies. And these are just examples of some of the designs that we've worked on in the past, just to show that it kind of looks like traditional gardening designs, with large amounts of species. So we're creating a big impact, creating species that flower from spring to fall. We're using shrubs and woody species and different heights and textures and grasses, and you're kind of making sure that you're ticking all the boxes in different colors depending on what the customer wants. And I think, yeah, that this is the backyard. So she's got some green space there to be able to see it kind of um, throughout the whole year. And this is actually um, the design of that garden that had the butterfly milkweed. So this was her design here. And then when it comes to maintenance, people do get really anxious about it. Every spring, I love seeing all the posts of saying, ditch the rake and stop, leaf blowing everything. And it doesn't have to be messy. I always say sometimes native plant gardeners just get perceived as like lazy. And you can actually like still maintain your gardens and have them look really beautiful while still supporting wildlife. What we do is we um, leaf blow the leaves off of our lawn in the fall before they've set and anything starts using them. So you're not disturbing anything in the spring, but we just push it into the garden beds and it creates wonderful free soil for us because we live in Muskoka and we have the world's worst soil. Um, so I love putting the leaves right into the garden bed and using it as mulch. You can try green living mulch, which is just ground covers. So wild strawberry is a perfect example. We use that too. And it's great because it'll just kind of trail around all the other plants and then it flowers like now, this time of year, and it looks fantastic. It just pops up with a little bit of color in the spring when we need it the most. Another one we get is like that 10-degree cleanup. And so it's a bit of a misconception, that 10-degree rule. I'm not too sure where it came from. Essentially in Ontario or like for most of like Canada, we have a lot of different types of pollinators that will emerge at different times of the year, some of them as late as like mid-June. And things are kind of using the landscape all year long. So we really want to disturb it as least as possible all year. Um, but like I said, if you do want to like remove the leaves, it's best to do that in the fall before things have kind of hunkered down in the winter and things overwinter in it. And then we kind of talked about the stalks already. So yeah, you can kind of cut them to like a foot or two above the ground, and it's still um, habitat for all those lovely bees. And I always like to remind gardeners to stop treating their soil like dirt. It is the best resource you have. And with native plant gardening, I find it actually does wonders for our dirt. So a lot of native plants have just evolved to have really deep roots because a lot of our soil is not great. So they really work within the soil. Don't till your garden. Avoid compacting your soil. If you do want to compost or add nutrients into your soil, feed it from the top down and let it kind of like work its way and don't work it in. When you kind of till your soil or work your way, with a pitchfork or something, you can imagine our soil is kind of alive with like tons and tons of different little microorganisms and bacteria and all these things that are living in there, working at trying to get you really healthy soil. So when we get in there and dig it all up, we're really just like shaking their house and stopping them from doing the work that they're doing. Whereas if you just kind of um, put the compost or the nutrients on top and let the rainwater or the water kind of feed it slowly, you get much better results that way. And so these are some other great resources. So the North American Native Plant Society, they have a lot of great information on their website. They do native plant sales as well. The Ecological Landscape Association is an American association, but they do a lot of great webinars. And there's good information that comes out of their organization. I just wanted to mention too the Native Plant Finder. So this is through Douglas Tallamy and I think his homegrown project. So he's an American and the organization is American, but what it does is that it matches plant species up with pollinators. So you can put in your area that you live and it'll show you all the native plants in your area. It'll show you the native moths and butterflies, so all the different Lepidoptera, and how they interact. So you put wild strawberry, and it'll show you the moths and butterflies that use that as a house plant. So it's really, really cool. Unfortunately, it is just American. So if you put in our postal codes, it won't work. So what I've done is I've tried to find the most northern, like New York postal code. And so it's, their um, landscape isn't that far different from us. We obviously share a lot of the same species. So that's it there, 13662. So you can use that and it'll give you really relevant information rather than trying to use Florida or something. And then a couple of his books is Douglas Tallamy, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, and Lorraine Johnson. So she's a Toronto author and advocate. And she has, I think, a new-ish book out called Rusty Garden for a Rusty Patched Bumblebee, as well as the 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants. So those are great resources with getting started. Um, there are online sources. There's Facebook groups. I would say the Ontario Master Gardener one is a great group, and the Ontario Native Plant Gardener one can be sometimes. It's gotten really big, so it's touch and go. I th These are just some more identification resources. And so that's my contact information now. So if you do have questions that you don't want to, get into the weeds with right now, feel free to email me or you can give us a call. Our nursery opens this Saturday as well. So you're welcome to visit. We're open Wednesdays to Saturdays, starting this Saturday, 9 to 5. Um, so I'm going to thank everyone now. I'll check to see if there's any questions. Um, and I also wanted to again mention, I put in the chat, so people are maybe wondering what these are just some links to petition or sign for against Bill 5, which was a bill put through on the Ontario government that is a threat to endangered species. So you can kind of take a look at those. One is through Ontario Nature, and the other one is through Climate Action Muskoka. Um, and so someone's asking about cedar mulch. Um, Read that cedar mulch repels bugs. How bad is it to have cedar mulch in a pollinator garden? Eventually, I just want to have green mulch, but keep now. Um, so I think she wants to have cedar mulch for her pollinator garden, but there's a lot of people that suggest not to have it. So this is what I do. Um, I don't know if it's the best practice, but I always come at it as a place of compromise. So for us, for the first year when we install a garden, I always use mulch and just like a thin layer. So I'm not out there doing mulch volcanoes. It's like an inch tops. And we'll use cedar or pine. It creates a lot of benefits for soil health and it does help with like moisture retention. And this is a big one, but it also can just help with like aesthetically. So like sometimes when we plant our gardens, the plants are still really quite small. And then you have a lot of exposed dirt. And it kind of gives you the case of like the womp womps, like you're kind of disappointed by it. And mulch can kind of make a garden look a little bit more finished. So I say use it in the first year. It will decompose. A lot of our native pollinators are like our cellophane bees don't like mulch because they like a open, sandy, exposed soil to create their nests in. So if you do have an area where cellophane bees or other ground nesting bees use, you can just leave that exposed. They don't need a lot of space. You can just leave little open patches, and if it's not a big layer of mulch, they will be able to get through it. But I don't think it's So back to your specific question about cedar mulch deterring insects. I've never heard that before. I doubt it's true. Unfortunately, the garden world is full of like so much misinformation. Um, Cedar mulch is terrific. It does have a nice scent. I don't think it's going to deter any insects. I would use it if you wanted to. You can also just use like a pine mulch, and it will degrade faster. So that is a benefit. Someone's asking for native plants for shallow roots that would be safe for a septic field. So I always caveat that you want to make sure that your septic provider is on board with you planting on it, because sometimes they'll nullify your warranty if they don't allow it. So always check with them. Um, and there are a lot of shallow rooted native plants. So at the nursery, we have a section that's called like on the rocks. And those are plants that are tolerant of growing in really shallow soil. So like wild strawberries, harebells, prairie smoke. If you've ever visited a rock barren, like the Torrance Barrens, or an alvar, like the Cardin alvar, it'd be those type of species that would do well on a septic field. You can also check last week's webinar. I think I do get into that a little bit. So any of the like on the rocks type species will do well. Um, I think that's it for the questions. I think the hockey game is probably started as well. So hopefully we're actually doing well. If anyone cares, I don't know. It's probably a different crowd. Um, but thank you for joining us. If you guys have questions after the fact, feel free to shoot me off an email. Have a lovely night and enjoy the game if it's still going. And yeah, take care and thank you for coming.